Reed Edwards. Welcome back to Confessions of a Marketer. We have a fun one today. My guest is Jaclyn Schiff, founder of PodReacher, a done-for-you service that transforms podcast episodes into high-quality articles. Before starting PodReacher, Jaclyn worked as a journalist for leading healthcare publications in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, and also served as director of communication for a global health research association. As a writer, she's published in a range of publications, including NPR, NBC News, Thought Catalog, The Muse, and her ghostwriting skills were noted in a 2017 article in Marie Claire. Wow, with qualifications like that, I'm wondering how you ended up on my show. Jaclyn, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's wonderful to be here.
So can you share your background that I just went through and how you came to found PodReacher?
Yeah, so I am one of those people who has quite a non-linear career.
Join the club.
There you go. Those are the best kinds, I think.
Yeah.
So like you said, Mark, I started my career in journalism in Washington, D.C., actually mostly focusing on global health. So being in the midst of a pandemic, I do find this stuff very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so started in journalism, but then eventually kind of migrated over to the PR as well as a communication side and had a bunch of varied experiences. I'd say at my core, I'm a content person. I love to describe things in the written word, and I've sort of honed that through different professional experiences that I've had. About 4 years ago, I decided to go freelance after working at a healthcare publication, B2B healthcare publication here in Chicago. And, the first 2 years I was freelance and doing an assortment of things, including content strategy for an association as well as a startup. So just really kind of varied experience. I have been an avid podcast listener for many years. I like to say I started listening before it was like easy to get it on your smartphone.
Yep. It was
just,
like a 4 or 5 step process to get it on my old pod.
Exactly, and I remember those days and would still listen. And so, I've just always had an affinity to audio. As podcasting has grown as an industry, it's something, I've just personally been interested in. And I started noticing that people were wanting to, repurpose and leverage their audio content in different ways. Long story short, I, started working with a few podcasts where I literally was taking the content and repurposing it into a blog post or an article. That was about 2 years ago now, and the business has kind of grown from that foundation.
Mm-hmm. But tell me exactly what PodReacher does for podcasters.
Sure. So, our core competency is taking the spoken word and turning it into compelling text. So, we are a service that primarily takes your episode or really any recorded content. So sometimes we are working with videos, sometimes webinars as well, but primarily podcasts, and turning it into either a blog post or other kinds of long form written content. Sometimes we've done, white papers, even ebooks. And, again, the skill set is just how do you take a conversation, or a presentation that someone's giving and turning it into something that people actually want to read and share and get value from. And then in addition to that, we also do show notes, which I'm sure we'll talk about more later in this discussion.
Yeah. And my advice to a number of my clients in my consulting business who want to write white papers or, ebooks is to start with the audio, to have a conversation with the subject matter expert that they can then turn into multiple things. Often it's the white paper or the ebook that kind of leads. And I feel like it's far easier to just have a conversation with someone.
I couldn't agree more. And exactly, I think that's a terrific use case, for podcasting is exactly what you said, where you are talking to subject matter experts. And so sometimes, what I see a lot is, you might have these people within your company and, having also been a communications person in this position, you're trying to unlock that knowledge. And it's hard because these people have a lot on their plates, they have a lot of other things to do so that, to sit down and for them to actually write something about their expertise is really challenging to do. But if you say, hey, can I grab you for a 30-minute conversation, to just tell me about what you're working on, that's a lot easier to do, as you say. And then, leave the turning it into something written, depending on, what you need to use it for, to someone else, not the subject matter expert. So I absolutely love that use case. Another way I tend to think about podcasting, as part of kind of a holistic content marketing strategy is, a lot of times, and this definitely I think tends to be more the case for some of the smaller businesses and startups, is, it makes sense maybe for a founder to have a podcast as an opportunity to engage with stakeholders, whether it be prospects or, other folks that they want to develop partnerships and relationships with. And so it's so valuable to have that conversation and, kind of the structure of a podcast to accomplish that. But then again, there's so much great information in that conversation, which could also, eventually become part of your sales process. And so you have to, the first step is having the conversation. And then it's not necessarily the most efficient use of the founder's time, especially the podcast host, to then sit down, listen to the audio and, massage it in a way so that it makes for a compelling, piece of content in a written form.
Yeah, I'm obviously an advocate of podcasts, but I look at podcasts actually as a tool for B2B companies to use, as you say, in their content marketing strategy. And a couple of people I've mentioned this to have said, yeah, but there's like a million podcasts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I say, how many websites are there? How many B2B companies are there? How many companies are there that have websites? It's way more than a million, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my feeling is if you have a website and you're doing content marketing, audio, forget about the term podcast for the moment, audio and multimedia should be part of that, right? Because people learn in different ways. Visually, they like to listen to things, they watch things. So just having a website doesn't really cover all the bases.
Exactly. I mean, I think, if you are doing marketing in 2020, you have to go to where the audience is and you have to provide content in a format that is going to appeal to the audience when and where they see it.
Yeah.
And, some people might like listening to a podcast. Some people might never listen to a podcast. Some people might listening to it some days, but sometimes they might prefer seeing text. Sometimes they might prefer, they might consume it as a LinkedIn update. So you just, you need to cover your bases and have it in a format that's appropriate for the platform that you're serving it on.
Yeah, so that brings me to my next question. Okay, say you're producing a podcast. How should people look at the content they're producing for that podcast? Not in a vacuum. They shouldn't look at it as, okay, I've done the podcast, I had it edited, or I just posted it and it's been distributed and I'm done. I'm going to move on to the next one. But that's what you're advocating, is that they shouldn't look at it as in a vacuum, that it should be repurposed into articles and blog posts and, ebooks or white papers, that there's more to make out of that content than just one thing.
Absolutely. I think of it as an efficient way of scaling your content strategy. And the reason you want to have, lots of different types of content is, not just to create more noise, but again, you're creating content because you're trying to reach certain people. And so, what happens a lot of times with the podcast is people put a lot of effort into, like setting up that conversation. There's the prep before, there's scheduling the guest, there's, doing the research to make it a fruitful conversation. And it ends up being valuable. And, what I'm saying and what we help businesses do is unlock the value of that conversation to scale your content and put it in the different places where it needs to be. Now, there's obviously, to your point, there's lots of different types of repurposing. You can repurpose for social, and that's very valuable. All we do, though, is taking the spoken word and turn it into readable, shareable text. I think it's a very specialized skill set, and I think it requires a lot of effort and attention to do it well and to ultimately see results from it. There's a lot of different strategies and directions that you can go with that, right? So you could think about taking the podcast content and turning it into content for your sales funnel, right? And this would be, white papers, ebooks, that kind of thing. Another approach, and we do a lot of this, is so people are publishing a podcast. Maybe they're publishing it with, a show notes page. So they're putting the episode on their website. And then, a month or two later, we turn it into a blog post, which then gets posted to their website and is building out the SEO traffic to their website. So it's making you discoverable through that channel. And what's very interesting with podcasts is, people think about, as they absolutely should, visibility in Apple and the different players and advertising on different shows. And that's certainly like the number one thing you want to do to drive listenership. But people, for whatever reason, don't think about Google as a discovery channel for podcasts, which is a huge oversight.
Right.
Because, how many times a day do you go into Google?
Yeah. And just search for such and such podcast, right? I mean, it can be a great tool for discovering things. Whether you end up listening to the podcast in Google, it's certainly a way to discover.
Right. And even if you're not searching for a podcast specifically, if I'm searching for, B2B content marketing,
Yep.
and I could find my way to your podcast. If I make my way to the website, it looks interesting enough. There's nothing stopping me from being like, wow, this podcast is highly relevant to, what I'm looking for, and, subscribing right there. I mean, that happens.
So you guys were gracious enough to do a marvelous job on a previous episode. And I kind of want to just walk through that if we can, and just describe what it's like to have, a podcast that I recorded and I wrote some brief show notes on, listened to and kind of analyzed by someone outside of my brain. It's because doing show notes. So I started this show in 2017 and I've done, 170 episodes or something like that. And I had, so much ambition for this when I started, and I did transcriptions. I did really in-depth show notes, but it gets to be a real chore.
Mm-hmm.
And it also, I found that I'm not the best one to figure out what was important in what we said. Friends of mine will listen and say, hey, I heard so-and-so say this on your podcast. And I say, really? I don't remember that, because I'm in the conversation, right? And I found it really enlightening to send you guys a link and have you take a look at the content, give me a description, a summary, even episode title options and insights and, resources and highlights. It was really enlightening. Some things that I hadn't really even thought were in that episode. And this was one we did several weeks ago called Video in Marketing. I'll put the link in the show notes for this. It's just so much more robust than I could do myself. So I'm, really impressed by it.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Yeah, well, it was a pleasure to do it for you. We spoke before and I said, I'd love you to just, try it out. To your point, if you are, creating your own podcast and, even for some folks that are working with a small team, and so maybe they're outsourcing the editing, it's a lot once again, you've, put all the effort into creating a great episode to then do, an A+ job with the show notes. And I think it's very interesting what you said in terms of, when you hand it off to someone else, they sort of see it through a different lens. Memory is a very interesting thing. And I think when you're in the conversation, and obviously, you've been the one who's spoken directly to the guest, you're seeing it through your own lens. And I think one of the really important things that we do with show notes, as well as, repurposing into blog posts or articles, is we're thinking primarily through the lens of the audience. And that when you submitted the show notes to us, we ask you the first time you submit to us, there's a questionnaire and we say, who is the audience? And that's really important because if I was going to say, like, if, general like business owners were listening to this podcast, you'd pull out different pieces of content than if it was, marketers. Like we can get really granular, right,
Mhm.
on what you would pull out of the episode. So yeah, so I think there's something to that. I think the other thing with show notes is for a lot of people, and again, it's often just due to resources and time, they're an afterthought. They kind
Mhm.
of are like, I've made this podcast. I have to do this because it needs a description when I submit it to the app, and it's unfortunate because it's a missed opportunity.
One thing that is frustrating with the various platforms that people listen on is that show descriptions, show notes, even individual episode images are
Mm.
not necessarily used in the same way. So I direct people for my podcasts to a website,
Yes.
which using a plugin in WordPress embeds the audio from where we host the shows, and it looks really good. But I doubt that, well, I know that most people don't listen to it on my website, that they listen to it in a player. And I listen to a lot of shows in Apple Podcasts. And I've got to, admit that I don't necessarily read the show notes there. So what role should show notes play? Are they more for attracting visitors to your website and for SEO, for other purposes?
Yeah, it's a good question. And even the term show notes is very ambiguous. I think I once put out a tweet and I said, like, when I say show notes, what do you think? And I was asking podcasters on Twitter, and people were very split, which I was shocked about because I typically think of, yes, the text that is attached to an episode page on a podcast website. But some people thought that meant what they see in the podcast app, whichever
Hmm.
podcast app they happen to be, which I would call the, podcast description, right? Or episode
Right,
description.
right.
So, I think that's kind of a problem that we run into. Like, what do we mean when we say show notes? I think the opportunity here is that when you start your podcast, or at least when you get serious about marketing it, asking yourself the question you asked, is this primarily a marketing opportunity or is it a tool for people who might be listening to your podcast?
Yeah.
Or is it a hybrid, right? Because that is going to change the strategy and, first of all, like how much effort you put into creating content for the episode page versus, you're just going to create a really good description and, having a podcast website or having your podcast live somewhere on your business website isn't a priority for whatever reason. So it's very individual. What I would say to the point of SEO is, I've done some work with Brendan Hufford, who he's kind of like my go-to SEO person. He's really terrific, very knowledgeable. And, we actually helped him a little bit with his podcast, SEO for the Rest of Us. I love the name of that podcast. And he was analyzing, can a show notes page rank in Google? And he did a lot of research. And basically the finding was he didn't find a show notes page that ranked. If you want your page to rank, you really need to have, a more significant amount of text and
Yeah.
meaningful text than what we typically think of on a show notes page. So again, if SEO, if you're, trying to align your podcast with SEO, and that's a big part of your content strategy, you definitely want to be repurposing into articles. And I've seen podcasts that they won't have a typical show notes page. They'll have the page for the episode, they'll have the player in there, and then they'll have like a 1,200 to 1,500 word article that is based on the episode.
That's essentially what you gave me for my show of a few weeks ago, was a description that we can use for our podcast and have that go into Apple and Spotify and Google and so forth. But then there's an extensive kind of write-up about the show and the various components and quotes. And it is just tremendous. And it's a heck of a lot more complete than I could do myself. I want to talk about how you actually do that and what goes into effectively turning audio into readable and shareable text. How do you actually manage to do that? Obviously, someone listens to it, right? And what's the process?
Yeah. So with show notes, someone is listening to it. And so right now we have a team of 25 25 writers who I basically screen. So it's interesting screening writers when you're a writer yourself, because
I've done it. It's hard.
It's hard. You're overly picky. In my case, I'm probably too in my head about it, but there's definitely a perfectionism there. And, I'd say probably 1 in 10, 1 in 12 people that we end up testing, we end up working with. So the writing team I have so much confidence in and know that they can do this well. So let me actually talk through the process of taking an episode and turning it into a blog post, because that's obviously a more intensive writing process. And, so even before listening, so we kind of talk about this at a top level of having 4 steps. And so the first one, even before listening, is you want to think about the strategy. Where are you planning to publish this? Is this, going to live again on a podcast website, on your business website? Are you going to publish it to LinkedIn, or are you going to submit it to industry publications or as a guest post? Because that's a use case we've seen that I think is very interesting. We've worked with a software company, and we've turned episodes into articles for them that they've submitted to major tech publications, including TechCrunch, and had them published there. So it's, they did the work, did the interview, and then we turned it into an article that they can now say their podcast was featured in TechCrunch, which is, really valuable for brand awareness. So first step is to think about, how you're going to use it, because that's going to influence how you write it. And, obviously, if you're submitting it as a guest post, you want to pay attention to contributor guidelines and stuff like that. The next step is to actively listen to the episode. And a lot of times clients will say, well, if I give you a full transcript, can someone just create an article based on that without listening? Because, part of our pricing reflects that someone is actually listening to your episode start to finish. And in my experience, that just doesn't produce the same caliber of content, because there's so much that you're able to gain from listening to, for example, the reaction of the host to certain things that you just don't pick up from a transcript.
And I'll tell you, that's one of the reasons I stopped putting transcripts on my show pages, because I felt like it really isn't the same as listening. And just like there's no intonation or emphasis in email, and you can be offended by someone saying, "What do you mean?" in an email, when, if you actually heard them say it, it wouldn't feel as offensive. You know what I mean? I mean, so when you read a transcript, you don't really get the feeling that you get with someone's real human voice.
Exactly. And especially, the types of podcasts that we tend to work on sometimes are very industry specific, and we're really in the weeds on certain topics like, finance or retirement or something like that. And so, again, because you're writing for a specific audience, listening to the conversation will give you a clue as to what might be really important to that audience, or what might be surprising to them. So listening to the episode, I think, is pretty non-negotiable. The next step is to then sit down with your notes, and while you're listening, obviously, you're also like grabbing some of the, interesting quotes and language that was used in the episode. And writing it means, structuring it, not necessarily following the flow of the episode, because a lot of times, people start off and they have to ease into a conversation, and it might be 20 or 25 minutes in that they're really getting to the meat of it. And you probably want the meat of it higher up as part of your introduction, right? To hook readers from the beginning. So the writing process is where you structure it and create this cohesive narrative based on the content from the episode. And then the last step is really important. That's where you edit, position, and refine it. And I always say if there's a key to standout content, it's editing. And that goes for any format. Your first draft is never the best draft. So I think it is really, and this, even if we're not doing this for you, you can always self-edit. And so like, even if you write something up and you sleep on it for a night, I guarantee that if you look at it the next day, you're going to be able to improve it a little bit. So that editing is really important. But this is also the step where, we're thinking just on the content marketing front, we're thinking about like, how do we position this? So who's going to be reading this? And like, what's a message that's going to really resonate with them? And so an example that I would give for how, practically this works is, So we work with Squadcast. We're recording on Squadcast right now. And we turn their episodes for their podcast Between Two Mics into content for their blog. And they did an interview with Chris Kremitzos, who's the founder of Podfest, which is a major podcast industry conference.
Yep.
So they did an interview, and they didn't say to Chris during the interview, they didn't say, hey, Chris, how does it feel to be the podcast industry super connector, right? But when we were like, step back and we were like, oh, this guy's the podcast industry super connector. You know, he's made a conference to connect all these podcasters. So we use that in the headline. You know, that's like an eye-catching thing because people are going to want to know, like, who is the super connector? And then also that's obviously a title that he's proud of. So he's incentivized to share it. So that's what I mean by positioning, is thinking of opportunities to, you know, intrigue and, you know, draw your reader in.
Yeah. And I should explain, Squadcast is this great system that I use and many podcasters use to record interviews with people who aren't in the same room. And yet it sounds a lot better than a Zoom call because it's engineered and designed for recording on individual devices. So it's tremendous technology. And it's really interesting what you just said about that interview, the Squadcast podcast. And that was my experience, is you notice things that just go right over my head. When I'm interviewing someone, your analysis was that you really were talking about this. And it's like, oh, yeah, you know, you're right. But that's the way conversations go, right?
Yeah. You know, I think conversations aren't linear, you know, and we don't speak the way we write, or hopefully not. You know, so, and that's the thing. And that's why, you know, this is like a skill set that we just focus on, because again, I think there's an art to extracting this information and then, you know, positioning it for the reader.
Yeah. So you're building an empire, and I want to find out about this acquisition you just completed, a newsletter called Podboxer. What's that all about?
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly the name was so similar to Podreacher. I had to have it. No. So actually what happened there is, you know, you will know this, that, you know, podcast discovery is challenging. And there are all these different newsletters that make podcast recommendations. And I subscribe to a number of them, including Podboxer. So Podboxer is a newsletter. And I actually knew the guy, Paul Metcalf, who was running it. And he would just send weekly recommendations. And this was for business podcasts. And, you know, and it was typically stuff's kind of in the entrepreneurship. Yeah, just kind of dealing broadly with entrepreneurship, I guess, let me put it that way. He sort of got busy with other projects. And I really liked this newsletter and saw it as an opportunity to help promote, you know, the podcasts, the kinds of podcasts that we work with.
Yeah.
This definitely is not a pay to play or anything. And, you know, we're not guaranteeing placement for our clients. You know, I took it on basically as a content marketing opportunity for Podreacher, where, you know, the content absolutely comes first. Our goal is to recommend podcasts that help you with business growth. So whether that be through sales, marketing, you know, we want to uncover the best episodes that'll help you grow your business if you're an entrepreneurially minded leader, right? And so that's the goal. The newsletter is going to resume in December. So there will be weekly episode recommendations. And what we've done as well is added a blog to the Podboxer website that features business growth advice. But our slant is that it's all sourced from podcasts.
That's tremendous.
Yeah.
I'll be interested to watch that grow over the next year or so. It's interesting because, you know, as you said, podcast discovery is usually like a friend will say, oh, you should listen to such and such.
Yes.
And finding out about them more systematically is probably the better way to do it.
Yeah. You know, I think it's another way to find out about them, you know, and I think we've talked about a few other ways that you can do it. I mean, I really like email newsletters and a lot of people do. So it's another discovery channel.
Yeah, great. So to wrap up, where do you see podcasting going over the next few years? I've talked to a number of people, and some people think, oh, it's peaked. And I don't believe that. I think that it's going to become bigger and bigger for the next several years at least. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm with you there, Mark, which probably isn't a surprise. But yeah, I think to go back to, an earlier point that you made, I think that there's a lot of different podcasts. And I think a lot of times people will just think about like, okay, how do you build audience for this podcast? And I think audience building for podcasts is going to get more and more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think it can be a very powerful way to deliver a very specific kind of content for a specific kind of audience. And so I think we're going to be seeing a lot more different use cases for podcasts. I was just speaking to someone earlier who actually just focuses on internal company podcasts.
Oh, yeah. I've talked with many clients about that. And it actually harkens back to something that I used to do a lot of in the 80s and 90s. And that was for salespeople, education for salespeople on cassettes, right? And we would send them out. And that was kind of like a proto podcast. And we're doing it again with this technology.
Yes. And I think now we just have easier. You don't have to get record on a cassette and then send it in the mail, right? It's all digital. And especially now with the conditions that we find ourselves in, where so much of work has had to go virtual, there's a huge opportunity for companies to be keeping employees informed that way. And then also, I've seen it a lot with recruitment. People, using podcasting as a way to recruit and bring in, talent into their talent pipeline. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. For the general, I guess, consumer-facing podcasts, I think we're already seeing this. But, it used to be... the last few years, I think there's been an explosion of the long form interview format. People haven't had to be constrained to time sensitivities. And I think there's a bit of a backlash to that, for lack of a better term. And so I think people are definitely gravitating and craving more shorter form content.
Right.
And so I've seen a lot of podcasts pop up where it's just 5 or 10 minutes. So I think we'll certainly continue to see a lot of that into 2021.
Yeah, I had this thing with this podcast where I tried to keep it to 15 minutes and then the conversations would keep going. And I thought, well, why don't I break it into 2 episodes? And that seemed artificial. So I've just let them become organic and they go as long as they go. Sometimes they are 15 minutes, 20 minutes, but we've been going for 38 minutes and 35 seconds.
I was going to say, sometimes you get like a long-winded guest like me.
No, but
then,
what I found is that when I stopped worrying about how long it was, they actually become more kind of in-depth and engaging discussions, which is what we've had. We haven't just said, okay, what's Podreacher? What do you do? And how do you, and then, okay, hey, thanks. This has been a more substantive discussion, I think, because I've kind of thrown away the idea of keeping it to 15 minutes.
Yeah. And I agree, and obviously you did a lot of preparation before this episode and, we kind of knew some of the topics we wanted to address. So that helps a lot. I think, and I don't think there's a problem with longer as long as you can, to your point, engage the listener's attention. And, this is another point that I think you've just made is it's very hard to be brief and to be valuable.
Yeah.
That in some ways takes a lot more work to do that. So, but I certainly think there's a market for both.
Yeah. I agree. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion, Jaclyn. Thanks so much for joining me. It was really informative, and I want to challenge myself to see if I can write some notes and articles about this, live up to the quality and the bar that you set.
Oh, well, thank you. I take that as a high compliment, Mark. I know you can, but I think as it does for a lot of people, it just comes down to time and priorities, and we all have so much competing for that and for our attention. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, that does it for this week. Thanks for listening. I'm Mark Reed Edwards, executive producer, writer, and host of Confessions of a Marketer. Shep Salau is my producer, helping put together the shows every week. Annalyn Timball is my assistant, and she helps with guest relations and getting everything scheduled just right. Thanks, Shep and Annalyn. Confessions of a Marketer is a trademark of Podco Media Networks, and this episode is copyright 2020. Stay healthy, and see you next time.